Assembling the Synchro-Compur shutter, I start with the retainer plate for the diaphragm blades. As one side has small indentations where the shutter blade pivots sit, that goes down on here. So we've got the flat side upwards on the jig. And then all I need to do is assemble my diaphragm blades. These all go on the same way. The pivot is the rivet that's closer to the middle of the blade. That pivot goes into the hole on the plate here. The blades are just assembled counterclockwise. Make sure the blades are all going in the same way. These blades are not entirely flat. I can see that they're bowing up a little bit, but they're pretty good. Now I have to start pulling back the original blades, the first blades I put on there to expose the hole to allow me to place the next blade. Of course the blades are very light, very easy to knock them out of place. So it's not at all uncommon to have to do this task multiple times before you manage to get it right. That's certainly springing that blade. It's possible one of them has popped out of position there. Last blade. Now I have to lift the earlier blades over the top of the later blades without catching them on anything. Now one of those blades at least is displaced, I can tell, because the spacing of the blades is not even. This blade here is certainly moved. We've got two choices at this point. I can either start again or I can soldier on and see if I can recover. We'll see if I can recover. This plate is the moving plate and the brass side goes up on this jig. And I'm just getting the pivots centered into the slots. And I've got that one position out from where it needs to be. To lift that off. Right, so on the plate there are 3 holes where it fixes to the shutter case. 2 of them are fairly close together. This piece here, this mounting hole here on the brass ring should be close to that edge and beyond that hole there, on this side of that hole. That all looks complete, that all looks good. Now I'm going to lower the case over the top. We've got it line up, we've got 3 holes, 3 threaded holes here which line up with those 3 holes in the case, in the plate. It's about there. I'll flip this over, I'm holding it firmly with my fingers. I'll lift my jig off the top, place it through underneath. I'll line up the screw holes in the shutter. I can see 1 or 2 of the rivets are not sitting in their places. There are 3 screws that hold this in place. One of them is a countersunk head screw. Got to make sure that goes in the correct position, and that's the countersunk hole there. Help if I had a screwdriver. I'll get that screw started. I've just run that down very lightly, bearing in mind that I know some of my pivots are probably out of position. I'll take one of the 2 plain screws, drop that into position again, only ran it down very lightly, and the 3rd screw the same. Now I'm inspecting the pivots, and they have a little hole in the centre of them, and I can pick it up with the end of my tweezers and manipulate those pins and those pivots into place because they're very close. They're only slightly displaced. All of those are in position now. I'll do the screws up again very lightly so they no more than contact, they're not done up tight. You can take that piece off the jig now and move the moving plate to see that the diaphragm blades are all in place correctly and that they open and shut smoothly with a nice circular opening, and that's all good. So I can tighten up those 3 screws now. They're quite small screws, they're only going into an aluminium housing which is quite thin, so don't overdo it doing those screws up, you'll end up stripping them out and that would be a bother and a nuisance. Just checking the action of that. That seems quite smooth. It's not loose by any means, but it's more than adequate, it's good. So now I've got the setting lever, and the setting lever runs at the bottom of the shutter. So we've got to line up our holes. We've got the hole here has to line up with the cutout on the plate here. And then there are 2 shoulder screws that go in here. The piece the setting lever below is quite thin, it's brass. The screws are quite small, they're brass too. They're easy to strip out. Don't go mad doing them up. Get them in, check the action, make sure it's all good. Bit of fluff on here, what's that? Get that off there. The action's all good. I'll turn that round to expose the screws again in the holes, and I can nip those screws up a bit tighter. That's good. So there I have the diaphragm assembled in the case. It's smooth. It's by no means very free moving. Something's rubbing on something. I'm looking to see what it is. It'll be the setting lever for sure. It's probably been bent slightly. They're often bent down away from the screws to provide some tension against the case. That provides some friction so that it's not too loose. In this case, I think they've probably overdone it. I'll bend that up slightly. So I'll just slide my scalpel blade in underneath there, give that a tweak up. The same on the other side. Yes, that's much better, that's much smoother. So I'm quite happy with the feel of that. And I can move on to doing the mechanism plate now, and then we can close the shutter up. Next task is assembling the mechanism plate. Well, the mechanism plate's all been cleaned, it's ready for reassembly. I'm going to start by putting back the blade actuating ring. Now there's a pin on one side of the blade actuating ring. It drops down into that little position there. That's where the lever on the top of the mechanism plate picks it up. That just drops into position. Just remove that bit of fluff. The retainer only goes in one position. It's pretty obvious which way that's going to go because this has to fit in that cutout in the plate. We have 4 screws. 3 of them are short, 1 of them is long. It pays to mark where the long screw came from. I'm just checking. Yes, this is the short screw at this side. The short screws are all in positions where the mechanism plate is relieved on the other side for clearance to allow some component to move through that space. And that's why the screws are short. And there's no advantage in using a short screw if there's enough meat in the casting to allow a longer screw to be used. Check that I have my 4 screws snug down correctly. The long screw is here. Check that that mechanism, the blade actuating ring, can move smoothly. It can, that's good. We have our lever that operates the blade actuating ring. I put a touch of molybdenum paste through the pivot hole in the centre of that, and in the little slotted hole where it picks up the pin on the blade actuating ring. That can be lowered into position. Now on this shutter there was a shim washer on top there. And that would have been there because there was a little bit of excess vertical play in that lever. There's virtually nothing for that shim to sit around, so I'm going to have to experiment with this to make sure I've got it seated correctly and that the screw isn't tightening up on the lever and stopping it from moving. Now that feels good. It screws snug down, the lever's nice and free to move, but I notice there's virtually no rattle in it at all. It's very snug. Just checking the action, making sure it's nice and snappy. That seems good. At this stage I normally use some graphite powder and drop it in here between the blade actuating ring and the mechanism plate and work it backwards and forwards. I don't use grease or anything like that in that position because that tends to get sticky over time and gum things up. And this component needs to move very freely indeed. Right, so I'm just going to go and blow the graphite powder out of that, make sure it's all clear, and then we can put the shutter blades on and close up the fit the case to the mechanism plate. Well, one thing I should have done, of course, was use some graphite powder to lubricate the retard gear train at this point. And normally I do that by dropping a little bit of graphite powder over the gears, holding back the pallets at this end, working the arm, the tip of my tweezers at the other end, just to distribute that graphite powder, make sure that all the working surfaces were covered. And now I've got to blow that out. Now to put the shutter blades back onto the shutter. First I unhook the return spring from the lever, swing the lever to the outwards position, which is the blade's open position. Find our blade number 1, which is the one with the extra hole. And that goes in this position here, next to that large rivet at that point. Blade number 2 goes here. 3 goes here. 4 goes here. and 5 goes there. Now there are 3 holes in the case where the fixing screws go through, 2 fairly close together, 1 well across the other side of the case, so it's not hard to line up where this is supposed to go. Lower that into position. And there are 3 screws that hold the case together. I'll just run those lightly down. Don't do them up tight, because if one of the blades became displaced while you were lifting the case back over the mechanism plate, it could be trapped and could get damaged. This seems to be working smoothly. I'll hook that spring back over there. Check the action, that appears to be good and snappy. Nip these 3 screws up. Check the action again. That's good. The blades are all nice and clean. On this shutter I didn't need to polish them with Brasso or anything. They were in quite good condition. They just required to be cleaned, which was done with Naphtha and a cotton bud. The diaphragm blades likewise were in quite good condition. Didn't really require much cleaning at all, but I did clean them all with Naphtha on a cotton bud, and they're moving nice and smoothly. No sticking. So now that shutter is ready to have the internal components fitted to the top of the mechanism plate and be closed up.